I love to tell the story, 'tis pleasant to repeat what seems each time I tell it more wonderfully sweet. I love to tell the story, for some have never heard the message of salvation from God's own holy word. I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and his love.
The lesson this morning is one that I find particularly difficult. Now, we all have things in our lives where we know what we should do, and then doing it is just so hard. And for me, this is one of the most difficult. I'll explain perhaps a little bit more as we go farther along. We're looking at persecution in this country today. The church really suffers little in the way of persecution. There are different levels. It can be just a verbal intimidation kind of thing, somebody just to mock you, make fun of you, that kind of stuff. That's kind of the gentlest form. We face that, no question about it. And it can go to the other extreme where persecution is to torture and to kill you for what you believe. Fortunately, we don't have that in this country, but Christians are faced with that in other countries. So we have a wide range. Let's take just a few questions. The first one is about government itself. We all have our views of government, what it should be and what it shouldn't be. But what is God's purpose for government? I mean, that's really what matters. But what is God's purpose for government? Why did he institute government?
For the basic regulation of society.
Okay, so we want to govern, to regulate. What would we be like if we were on our own? If there were no government at all in the world, none at all, what would society be like?
Chaotic.
at best.
Probably, even without a formal government, there would be barbarian type of governments where the people elect.
There would be necessity of some regulation to keep it under control. Because without any regulation, how about driving down the road? So there is a purpose for government. It is to give some governance, some regulation to society to keep it from devolving into total chaos. So it is a necessary thing. The next question I have for you is a very important one, but I don't want you to answer it yet. I want you to answer it in your mind. Don't speak out, please. But the question is, Christians, and how far should they go to obtain their freedom or to make sure that they maintain their freedom? They hold on to their freedom. Now, we probably have some pretty strong opinions about that particular question. But now, before you answer it, were you thinking political freedom? Were you thinking of this question in a political sense? That's natural for us, isn't it? Because of the culture in which we live, we have a lot of freedom, and any limitations that we start to feel, we get rebellious about the whole thing. Nobody should be imposing upon my freedom to do what I want to do. This is a free country. So when we look at this question, and we talk about how far should a Christian go, we tend to think of it in terms of the government. What should we do to make sure that our government maintains my freedom? Or how far should I go to change the government to make sure that I get the freedom that I deserve? That's not the question. Is there another kind of freedom? Well, we're going to find out. I'm not even going to let you answer this question yet, but I want you to think about it and see if you can think about it in terms of something outside the political side. To help answer that, let me consider a few different questions. First of all, those Christians who live in totalitarian societies, and some of those are quite brutal. I mean, you might take North Korea, for example. How would you like to live in North Korea? How much freedom do you have in North Korea? If you're in North Korea and you become a Christian, what in the world should you do? I mean, how can you live in North Korea as a Christian? How should you live in North Korea as a Christian? I mean, you have virtually no political freedom. You have virtually no freedom at all. So how should you live? Well, I've raised a few other questions around that. Should you leave the country? Should you try to assassinate the supreme leader of North Korea? Start a revolution? Let's change this. Let's make it a Christian democratic society. What should you do? Put yourself in that position. You're a Christian in a brutal, totalitarian society. What are you going to do? Or are you going to stand up and say, I am a Christian, and here's why you should be one too?
They would kill you.
Well, that's what's likely to happen. And if not kill you, then to torture you, create all kinds of problems. So it's a dangerous situation. But what are you going to do? What should they do? See, you're sitting over here, nice, safe, and comfortable. What should they do? What do you expect of them?
Stay alive.
Stay alive. Even if it means lying about who you are?
I think a Christian, and this is hard, should maintain his Christian testimony, but to seek to be as submissive in his, he can in good times to the government. And that might go better with.
Excellent point. In fact, we're going to talk about that a whole lot more as we go through this today. You can see the problem for a person in that culture is quite different from the problem in your culture. Not only in the persecution, but in the response to the persecution and in the freedom that is expressed. So what about a Muslim country? If you are a Christian in a country that is predominantly Muslim and is under Sharia law, how should a Christian behave? Should they convert and become Muslim? Now, that wouldn't be a Christian act at all, would it? Should they pretend to be a Muslim? That's not a Christian thing to do, is it? How far do you go? What do you do if you are a Christian? Some have suggested that we might know what that experience is like in this country at some point down the road. Different kind of problem, isn't it? Similar to the totalitarian kind of government, but a little different because it's a religious government, isn't it? The communist government of North Korea is not a religious government at all, but this one is now a religious government. There is Allah. You are to be a follower of Allah, not this Christian God. What about in this country? How should a Christian in this country deal with the persecution that comes along? Now, the persecution here at the moment is very different from the persecution that these other two groups of people face. It's been estimated that 70% of the people in the world live in one of those two first situations. 70% of the people in the world live under a totalitarian type of government or a religious government, Muslim, Buddhist. The Buddhists do this as well. Some of the Buddhist countries will kill Christians and persecute them the same way that the Muslims will. But what about in this country, where the persecution is different? It's at lower level. It's not this extreme where we're going to cut your head off or to abuse you or to do all kinds of things to you, but we'll just insult you, make fun of you, and it might even get to a little more extreme situation in some cases where a person might lose their job because they're a Christian.
I think the difference between here and there is that we do have certain rights as citizens, and I think a Christian has the right to appeal to those at times, like in a job.
So the government that we do have allows us to do certain things, and within the context of those rules, we should feel free to act to protect ourselves. We have guidance, protections built into the kind of government that we have, quite different from those people in those other situations. So our behavior is going to be different. Even though the persecution that we might face is downright gentle compared to what these people in the other countries face, we also have a lot of opportunities to even protect ourselves from that kind of persecution. What is our responsibility for those Christians who are in that 70% of the population that's in these other countries? What about that Christian that's in that totalitarian government trying to survive? What is our responsibility to them? Do we form an army and we go in and we rescue them and change their government for them so that they have more freedom? What do we do? Pray. That's one thing that we can do, right? And should do, and probably don't do very much. But we should have a concern for that brother or sister in that other place that is undergoing severe persecution. And there are millions of them, hundreds of millions of them.
We can use our foreign policy, too, to...
Going back to our position in the situation that we're in with the government that we have, there are things that we might be able to do through our government to facilitate. This is something for us to consider, is that we have brothers and sisters in these other places, and we have some responsibility to them as well. Although, given our situation, it's easy for us just to get comfortable. I mean, we are comfortable, and we can kind of settle back in our comfort and forget about the troubles of the world, forget about the troubles of brothers and sisters in other places that are suffering greatly. On this question, don't answer it, because you don't know. How would you respond to physical abuse or torture for your faith? We can sit here and jawbone about all that, and I would, or you don't know. We hope that we would be strong enough to do.
We trust God to give us that grace, that supernatural grace when needed. But also, if you look at the early church, we see a lot about those who stood firm, but there were a lot of people who crumbled, and then the church had to decide, what do we do with these people? Should we let them back in the church? So there were those even in that day.
It's a very difficult issue, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to go back and look at the early church to help us understand a little bit better about what we need to do today and what we may need to do in the future, or what we can help others who may face more critical situations in the future. But all of us, if we just looked at the question and immediately responded, would have no difficulty in responding to the question. We would stand firm. But in fact, when they start pulling your fingernails out, when they slaughter your children in front of you, when they do all these things, how strong will you be? I have a film clip for you this morning. It's a movie that goes back to 1951, Quo Vadis. It is an excellent film. Robert Taylor, Deborah Kerr, Peter Ustinov.
What does that mean, Quo Vadis?
Where are you going? It's in the film because the film is based on a novel that's based on a true story. So it's double fiction. A lot of truth in here, and you're going to see some excellent scenes. In the novel, Peter was in Rome. Persecution started in Rome, and Peter was leaving Rome to escape the persecution. And he meets Jesus walking into, now of course Jesus has been crucified and gone to heaven, but he's meeting Jesus, and Peter says, Quo Vadis, where are you going? So Peter asked the question, where are you going? I'm going to Rome to be crucified again. And Peter said, no, Lord, I'll go. So Peter returned to Rome, and in fact, Peter was later crucified upside down in Rome. I'm going to show you several different scenes. The first one is just the opening scene that a couple of minutes gives you a nice background for the whole thing and where everything's going. And then I'm going to show you a sermon that Peter preaches to the Christians in Rome around the time that the persecution is going to be beginning. Peter preaches a sermon to them about their condition, because we'll talk about Nero more later, but Nero was not a nice guy. He had been ruling for 10 years when all this opens up, and it's just not good for Christians. So in secret, they gather and they worship together, and Peter preaches a very interesting sermon that's appropriate for this lesson. And then we're going to show basically the Colosseum, a couple of things around the Colosseum, where the Christians in Rome are thrown into prison and then thrown to the lions. And so you're going to see some of that persecution that took place for the Christians.
Imperial Rome is the center of the empire, an undisputed master of the world. But with this power, inevitably comes corruption. No man is sure of his life. The individual is at the mercy of the state. Murder replaces justice. Rulers of conquered nations surrender their helpless subjects to bondage. High and low alike become Roman slaves, Roman hostages.
Obey those who govern you and the laws by which they govern. even though under them you suffer cruelties and witness maliciousness beyond your mind's dimensions, make no threat of violence in return. And in the words of Jesus, I further say to you, whosoever shall smite thee upon thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you.
General Claudius, his family, where are they? You're late if you want them. They're already imprisoned by the guards.
The Praetorians came and collected the whole scurvy lot.
He's raising my children right by the house of dirty Christians. Burn the city, will they?
Peace to the martyrs! Peace, peace to them! Take thy children, Lord. Numb their wounds, soften their pains. Give them strength, O Savior. Blessed are you, my children, who die in the name of Jesus. I say to you that this day you shall be with him in paradise.
They're singing.
Yes, sing to him as he now opens his arms to you. Sing to the welcome of Christ our Lord.
More singing. Why aren't they afraid?
The question I have for you is, how could they sing marching into the Colosseum to be confronted with the lions?
They were united.
United?
You know, maybe like when the apostles were beaten in Acts 5, that they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer for his name.
Any others?
Defiance.
Defiance. If you go back to the question that we had right before this, how would you respond when faced with abuse, torture for your faith? Could you sing through it? So what's it take? They know that they're going to die, which is like Peter saying, going into the welcoming arms of your Savior. I mean, what's the result? The result is that they are going to be with Christ now forever. So they have that hope, even at that moment when the lions come charging out, don't they? And they're trusting God is going to be faithful in fulfilling the promise that he's made. And they can sing. The background is really about what you saw in the movie. Remember, the Jews persecuted the church from the time of Jesus. The leadership of the Jews did not like Jesus and what he was doing, and so they saw that he was executed. And they then put the pressure on the Christians in Jerusalem and eventually chased Christians out of Jerusalem through persecution. So there was this great dispersion that took place. And so persecution really began with the Jews. Nero reigned from 54 to 68. And as the film indicated, it starts focusing on the year 64. And we'll get to that in just a moment as to why that year. But that's when the Roman persecution of Christians really began, was the year 64. But Nero had no real use for the Christians even prior to that, but they were pretty much tolerated. Nero was not a mentally well person. He killed his mother, killed 2 wives, killed a brother, killed several of his top advisors. How would you like to work for a guy like that? And it was all about him. I mean, he was an egomaniac, as many emperors will be. One of his dreams was to rebuild Rome. I mean, Rome had some beautiful parts to it, but he considered a lot of it to be just ugly. And it would be a much better city if we could remove these ugly parts and replace them with more beautiful buildings. And that was his plan. He was going to build a great city called Neropolis, to name it after himself, of course. In the year 64, there was the Great Conflagration. That is, a great fire where almost all the city of Rome was burned. People put 2 and 2 together and said, well, Nero wanted much of this city destroyed, and so maybe he did this. Now, that's not a good thing for the emperor to have people questioning him. He is like a god. I mean, that's how he sees himself, and that's how he wants people to see him. And so if these people are starting to question him now, is that he burned the city? But he didn't count on the people blaming him for it. And so he had to have a scapegoat. And the scapegoat he found was Christians. The Christians did it. That was the reference with the people running out with the things under their arms in the clip. They were ransacking the homes of Christians as finding anything of value that was theirs. As the Christians were arrested by the Praetorian Guard, they would run in and take whatever they wanted of the Christians' belongings. And the woman, as she was going out, says, "Burn our city, will they?" That was the belief then that the Christians were the ones responsible for the burning of Rome. And so persecution began. Nero, being a very creative guy, saw this as an opportunity not only to shift the blame, but to have some fun. And so you saw some of the fun to bring people together in the Colosseum and let everybody enjoy the fun. And we'll bring the Christians in and we'll throw them to the lions and let the lions play with them and feast on them, and everybody can have a good time. He had other fun games. The most absurd thing that he did was when he took Christians and tied them to posts, put pitch on them, lighted them, and had them all around the Colosseum, and then he had a chariot race at night. They were providing the lighting for his chariot race, burning Christians at the stake. They're responsible for this great fire. It's their fault. They need to be punished. Now, he's also responsible for the deaths of Peter and Paul. Shortly after all this, Peter is crucified upside down. Paul is beheaded. Paul's a Roman citizen, so they can't crucify him, so they just chop his head off. A lot of Christians died. Peter's first letter is dated about the year 64, almost certainly shortly after the burning of Rome and the persecution of the Christians there began. But if you go to the first chapter of 1 Peter, you find to whom he's addressing the letter. And it is to the people who have been exiled. It is to the elect in the Roman provinces who are exiles. So they are the elect, they are the believers who are in the Roman provinces, particularly in what's modern-day Turkey. And whether they're exiles from the Jewish persecution or the Roman persecution doesn't make a whole lot of difference to the message, but it's probably both. But he's addressing people who are in exile, people who have moved away to escape persecution, to try to find some safe harbor to avoid persecution. And this is possibly after the fire. If it's after the fire, there are almost certainly some Christians from Rome who may have had friends and relatives who died with the lions. They're in the Colosseum and have escaped now to this area of Asia, modern-day Turkey. In this first chapter, Peter gives some general principles for living our Christian life, for all of us at all time, no matter what our situation. But it applies especially to those who are in trials. First of all, he talks about hope and joy. He's dealing with the mental side of the thought processes here. And it is about joy and hope. And that's what you saw in the faces of some of those Christians marching into the Colosseum. You've been born again to a living hope. You have been born again to a living hope. That's an essential part of who we are. It is the hope that we've been given. And that's what Peter says at the beginning of this letter. You have been born again to a living hope. And you've received, as a result of that faith, that you have an imperishable inheritance, an inheritance that doesn't go away. That inheritance, of course, is our salvation. And with that inheritance, and knowing that we have that, the hope that we have in it, we can rejoice. We should have joy in our hope. We should rejoice, even in trials, Peter adds. Even in trials, we should continue to rejoice in the hope that we've been given. Now he says, now you're going to have some trials, and the trials will test your faith. They will prove your faith. They will prove the genuineness of your faith to you and to everybody else. So when you go through that trial and you stand firm, whatever the trial, but whatever trial you're going through that's testing your faith, it is a test of your faith. It is to prove your faith. And so that those who watch can see that here's a Christian, here's how a Christian responds to that situation. Then the outcome of that faith is the salvation of your soul. And with that, we have hope. I mean, that's where our hope comes from. We know that the outcome of our faith, because we've been given this faith, we know that the outcome of that faith is the salvation of our souls, that our presence with Him in heaven for eternity. And with that promise, we are confident and we are hopeful and we have joy, even in trials. And then he carries it to action. Okay, so that's nice to be thinking those nice, clean thoughts and everything's going well. But let's put it into action. What does it mean about what you do? He says, be holy in all your conduct. Okay, that sounds good. I understand that. Not easy to do. We all know that no matter what our situations, we're tempted to do this or that, and things can be difficult, and we might be tempted to do the wrong thing. And then he says, throughout your exile. Well, okay, so he's writing to people who are in exile. He says, throughout your exile, wherever you are out there, still be holy in all your conduct. These thoughts that we have about the joy and the hope are to be translated into action, the way that we behave. He says, you've been ransomed unto hope, ransomed by the precious blood of Jesus. A great price has been paid for the hope that you have. Remember that. He says, remember the price that's been paid for this. And that's important, particularly in the trials. When we're faced with that trial, is to remember what has happened, the price that's been paid for this to happen. And he says to love one another. Well, we've heard that before, and that's okay. I understand what that is, and I know that I need to do that. Even amongst ourselves, we might find someone in this group hard to love once in a while. I mean, you may look at me on occasion and say, boy, that's really hard to love that guy. And I can understand that. He says to love one another. So we might look at that and say, okay, that's good. Love our fellow believers. If that's what he means, that's difficult at times, but I can probably get through that. But he's going farther. That's not it. That's not what he's saying. When he says love the one another, he's saying it on a broader scale. It's like when Jesus was asking, who is my neighbor? He gave a much broader definition than anybody wanted to hear. You got a lot of neighbors out there that you don't like. Love one another. With that, the question is, how far do we have to carry it? Does all of our conduct have to be holy when we're dealing with our enemies? Those who abuse us, take our freedoms away from us. And just a reminder, in John quotes Jesus as saying, remember when they hate you, they hated me first. Remember, if they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. You will be persecuted. They did persecute him. That condition's been fulfilled. This will happen. They will persecute you. We will all have different levels of persecution in our lives. Many of us will escape this world without experiencing the kind of persecution that millions of Christians experience today. Remember this. In chapter 2, starting in verse 13, Peter gets down to the nitty-gritty of this whole thing. This is the harder part. It says, be subject to every human institution, every human government. Communist government? Muslim government with Sharia law? Yes. Be subject to every human government. He didn't say every human government except this or that. He said every human government. Every human institution. Then he goes farther. Be subject to the emperor and the governors. You must submit to the government, no matter how atrocious it may seem. Now remember, who's the emperor? Nero. Nero is the emperor. Nero's not a nice guy. What is he doing to Christians? Be subject to the emperor and to the governors. Then he talks about freedom. get into freedom now. So that's what we like. We want our freedom. So let's see what he has to say about freedom. He says it's a freedom that serves. He says, live as free people. That part we like. If he has stopped right there, there's a lot of parts in the Bible where if they just stopped at a certain point, we would really like it a whole lot better. But they just keep going on and telling us things that we don't like, but need to know. He says, live as free people. But he doesn't mean free people in the sense that we're thinking free people. It's not a political freedom, a government kind of freedom. Living as servants of God. Well, how free is that, living as a servant? Doesn't seem to mesh, does it? Live as free people, living as servants of God. So it is a life of service to God, and the way that we serve God is through serving other people, isn't it? He says that you are to honor everyone. Not just be subject to, you're to honor them. And then he adds, for Nero, honor the emperor. In our free society, when there's a politician that we don't particularly care for, we're quite comfortable in bad-mouthing that politician. And everybody does it, regardless of party. Everybody does it. When there's a politician on the other side they don't like, they bad-mouth the politician. Peter says, don't do that. That person is in that position because God put him there. It is by God's providence that people are in positions of authority. The people are in this position of authority because he put them there. His will, his providence. And we're to honor those. And if we don't do that, who are we dishonoring? Not only the person in that position, we're also dishonoring God. Now wait a minute, God put Nero in that position? He says, what about these unjust masters? What about the Neros of the world and others that we can name? He says, be subject to your masters. And those people in those governmental positions who are over you are your masters. In our free society, we don't like to think that. We don't want to think that. But that's the way that it is. They are in a position of authority in government for God's purpose of government, to regulate, to govern, to control. Be subject to your masters, even the unjust. Even when the master is unjust. And it's not just a slave-master relationship. It's in every relationship, including citizen-governor. He says, Jesus is your example. Now we have to think back. How was he our example? Well, was he unjustly treated? Was he abused? Was he persecuted? He was even executed. Did he have power to outside the government to do something? He did, but he didn't, did he? He subjected himself for us to the government, trusting the one who sent him. And that's the key for us as well, isn't it? To honor, to submit to these people, but to honor them and subject ourselves to them requires that we must trust God, that he does know what he's doing. And to not follow that means that we are saying he got it wrong and we have it right. Galatians chapter 5 is the great Christian liberty, Christian freedom chapter. So if you want to read about Christian liberty, Christian freedom, read that. But notice what Paul says, for freedom Christ has set us free. Wonderful. I'm back to my freedom again. Now, I like that, except he's not talking about political freedom. He's talking about spiritual freedom. Spiritual freedom, not political. And that's what Peter was talking about. You're free from the laws of sin and death. Christ has freed you from many, many things, but he may not free you from slavery, and he may not free you from an abusive government. You may be subject to an abusive government, as many, many Christians have been throughout the years. As Christ himself was subject to an abusive government. But Christ has set us free. That's a different kind of freedom. That's the only freedom that matters. The other freedom doesn't really matter. He says to love God and love man. And if we're going to do that, then we have to honor the people that God has put in the positions of authority over us. Political freedom is a gift. And we have great political freedom. We cry about how it's being taken away from us and all that. But we have great political freedom. But it is a gift of God. You don't deserve it. You didn't earn it. And that's important for us to remember. It's like God's grace in the salvation of our souls. We didn't earn it. We don't deserve it. We got it anyway. Political freedom is the same kind of thing. Undeserved, unearned. It's a gift. By God's grace, he has allowed you to live in this situation. How are you going to maximize the gift that he has given you, this great spiritual freedom in this great politically free environment, to maximize the message of Christ? And remember, they will persecute you.
I love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme in glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love.